I make me mad.
Mhm.
So we are responsible for our own reactions to things.
It's a different way of looking at the world, though, isn't it? All of a sudden think, and I think we tend to think we're going through the world and people are getting in our way and frustrating us and bad things are happening. Maybe they're not really bad. Maybe they look bad from one perspective and not from another. Any other thoughts on Wanyo?
Well, there's a Buddhist story that I'm aware of about a farmer who has a son. And he lives in a small town and all of a sudden wild horses run through their town. And he says, and his neighbor, and the wild horse stays on his property. And his neighbors say, "Oh, what good luck." And he says, "Maybe." And then his son is riding on the horse and he falls and breaks his legs. And then his neighbors say, "Oh, what bad luck." And then he says, "Maybe."
Mm-hmm.
And the emperor started a war and he wanted to come and conscript all the young men. And then his son wasn't able to go to war because his legs were broken. They said, "Oh, what good luck." And he said, "Maybe." So it's sort of like that. I'm sure you know that story,
That
but
sounds like Zen, doesn't it?
Yeah.
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 yeah, it depends on how you look at things.
Mhm. Exactly.
Well,
So maybe the sermon today won't be long and boring. Maybe it's, my perception. I'm kidding. Never long and boring.
George is not in the room.
Good.
Oh, no, you're safe.
Don't tell him. Don't tell him the horrible thing I said.
He simplified that whole concept. He said, if it's psychologically true, it's actually true.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we say something's in your head as if it means it isn't real, but
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
real too, isn't it?
I thought about that long and hard.
Yeah. These are Buddhist monks. What do you think these young people are doing?
Giving them alms of some kind.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's not trick or treat, as you might have thought. No.
That's what I thought.
Buddhist monks live off of donations. There's no money in the monastery. There's no money to buy food.
Mhm.
And they go out and beg and they have their meal and that's it for the day. So what do we know about the varieties of Buddhist life? Well, I can tell you some of the unifying factors of Buddhist life. First is the Buddhist declaration of faith that every Buddhist believes in. I turn to the Buddha for refuge. Pardon me. Somehow or another, Buddha is going to get me through. He's my, not necessarily savior, but he's certainly the guy pointing the way to me. I turn to the Dhamma. That's Pali for Dharma. So it's the religious law, all the teachings of the Sangha for refuge. And I turn to the Sangha itself for refuge. Okay. Not that interesting, but I thought you should hear it. So, Buddha's path is very demanding. I think we figured that out already. It's a path of extreme self-discipline, really no parties, right? No fun. Although they seem joyful, but you have to be a monk, really, if you want to be saved. No eating after lunch, no alcohol, hours of study and meditation. It's really hard. And there's no time for anything else. You can't do that and also be a plumber or something. But only people who do that have hope for liberation in this lifetime. So you can see where some Buddhists started to think, we need something a little more open than this. This is not really going to be good. Salvation is for the few who commit their every moment to it. So what about that kid? Well, he's not a monk. So what's happening to him? Most Buddhists will live normal lives. They'll get married, they'll have families, they'll have a business or a profession or a trade. And they will live outside the monastery and they will not achieve salvation. They do their best, however, and there's some rules for them, and they seek what's called merit. And this is in the karma system. they can get good karma by doing, like giving offerings to the monks, for example, and other things that they do, they can get merit. So this is one of those systems where the religion is so demanding that very few people can actually do it. Relatively few. I mean, there's a lot of monks, but not that many compared to how many people there are. Soon after the Buddha's death, you might be surprised to know, divisions arose in the Sangha. And that tends to happen, doesn't it? I mean, when after a leader dies, we start to find ourselves at odds, different interpretations. Is Buddhism only for that highly disciplined individual, or is there a message of salvation for everybody in there? And Theravada is the tradition that says Buddhism is for the few. If you're not in the Sangha, good luck next life. But the people who are in the Sangha have a shot at salvation. You don't. You can get a better rebirth, but you can't get salvation. And those who thought it should be opened up became what we call Mahayana. So this is why there's so many different forms of Buddhism. Zen, somebody mentioned Zen earlier, Pure Land, Nichiren. Now, a major contrast in this divide is for Theravada, there's nobody to help you. You are ultimately on your own. Nobody's going to help you one bit. But for Mahayana, there are savior gods. This doesn't sound like Buddha. It doesn't sound like his original teaching. There's one there. Now, it's not literally a god, but it's an enlightened being who dwells outside of the realm of space and time and has powers and can transfer merit to you. So if you're praying for something, you don't have enough merit to earn it, the Bodhisattva might lend you some. So Bodhisattvas make Buddhism a lot more interesting, I think, in a lot of ways. You can see where it can open up widely now. And all forms of Mahayana have Bodhisattvas. There's a Bodhisattva there in the upper right. Here's a Buddhist, looks like Theravada guy in the upper left. In the lower left, there's some statues of Buddha carved out of a mountainside. And then the lower right, that's a Zen garden, which are very lovely and peaceful. And we mentioned this before, but Theravada spreads a bit. I mean, it doesn't just stay in India. It goes up to the northwest. It goes down to Sri Lanka. Then it comes up to Burma and places in Southeast Asia. But Mahayana goes everywhere. It's up in China. It's up in Korea. It's up in Tibet. So there's two kinds of Buddhism, and they all take off and spread. And they all get along, I think. I don't think there's any battle between them or anything. This is a modern American take on Buddhism, I guess.
No alcohol.
Yeah, the no alcohol thing, that a lot of people found that difficult.
Mhm.
So, as you know, Buddhism is deeply ingrained. It's probably the religion that has the most impact on how Asian cultures have developed. It influences how you live your daily life. The architecture, I'll show you something interesting in architecture. Music, festivals, birth, marriage, death, all the things we do. Now, everywhere in Buddhist countries, you will find a stupa. It's a typical Buddhist structure for worship, but you don't go in. It's a burial mound. Now, it can be an ornate burial mound, but it's designed as a burial mound. And the first ones had parts of the Buddha's body. But, you kind of run out of that after a while. And it's, stupas are a reminder of death. So what you do at the stupa is you walk around it several times. You might prostrate yourself, lay flat on the ground, and then crawl up and do that again. Various ways of debasing yourself. So there's a very basic stupa, and it's enough to get the job done. There's a somewhat more ornate stupa. That's an even larger and fancier stupa, and that's also a pretty big one. So you will see this in Buddhist countries, either, if you travel there or if it's on TV or something. And the thing to keep in mind is that this is a definitive sign you're in a Buddhist area. Any thoughts at this point? Anybody want to chime in? It's interesting, isn't it, that it's a burial mound? It's like,
Yeah.
this religion kind of has the emphasis on the negative. What choice?
Nothing,
Oh.
I looked at you.
Why would anybody look at me if they didn't have to? Think about it, right?
Trying to keep the dog from,
Hunter is extremely squirrely today, so we're hoping he doesn't make too much noise here. This is a very interesting stupa.
Mhm.
See if I can,
Wow.
can't remember the name of it. I guess the name is the name on there? Oh yeah, the Satagu Buddha Vihara Temple. And this actually you can go into. It's a stupa shaped temple you can go into. So any guesses as to where this is?
You gotta say it louder.
No, it's here
Pardon?
in the Greater Chicagoland area.
It's not here in Chicagoland area, but you're getting warmer. This is in Austin, Texas.
Oh,
So your Texas Buddhists like to line up, put their spurs outside and walk in, I guess. So again, the two traditions, there's Theravada, the wisdom tradition, and Mahayana, also called the Great Way, the compassion tradition. And then there's a third thing that's called the diamond vehicle. Now, I always thought that was just part of Mahayana, but things I've been reading lately, it seems like we're looking at this as a separate thing now.
Mm.
So the separate thing is the diamond vehicle, but basically it's Mahayana. So we know about that. Theravada is found in Sri Lanka, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos. And the fundamental institution is the monastery. And very often that's where you get your education. As a boy will enter the monastery, and that's where you will learn how to read and become familiar with literature and numbers and things like that. And the goal is to, you got a long life. Let's see if you can achieve enlightenment, become what's called an arhat, the person who's made it. And now, if you're not in that group and you're not going to make it, what do we have for you? Well, seek merit. We talked about that before. Obey the 5 precepts. Okay, what are they? Do not take life. So you can't be a butcher. The guys that wheat and meat over here probably are not Buddhists. At least Theravada Buddhists. You can't take a butcher, but you can eat meat for some reason. Don't steal. That's good advice, I think. Do not, as they say, act basely in sexual matters. You don't have to be celibate like the monks, but we get the sense that there's kind of a strict code of sexual morality for laity. No lying and no alcohol. I
Question
could,
question about that, David.
yeah.
Does this cover people who are not like on the gender spectrum? Does that number 3, does that refer to anybody in like who might be gay or homosexual or something like that?
That's a good question. It seems like it's open to interpretation. It seems like you might take it as, well, you should never engage in homosexual acts, as we call them, or maybe be in a faithful relationship. I think it's open to interpret. That's a really interesting question, right? We're kind of making this traditional assumption that everybody identifies as a male or female, and they can get married and have children. So what else is available? But very good question, and it's something we probably should look into. See if it's there.
Are there gay monks, for example,
I'm sure there are, but
that are
They're
out and
celibate.
accepted in their community, you know, like that? Yeah, I just,
Well, they're being monks, do they?
if you're a monk, you have to be celibate.
okay, so you could
Did I
be,
step on somebody there?
if you're a monk, you have to be celibate?
Yep.
So if you're a Buddha, you can get married, but if you're a monk, you cannot.
Yeah, if you're in laity, you can get married, but if you're a monk, you cannot, and therefore you are you're gonna have a fairly limited sense of experiences, right? Mahayana, does anybody else have anything to say about that? We're not in a big hurry. Although I don't have my watch on, I have no idea what time it is, but no, it doesn't. Not when it's in this mode. Do you have one, Joyce?
25.
Oh, 25, okay. Mahayana is the one that is more widespread. It's found in China. And China is where it goes through lots of interesting developments. And then those developments from China go to Japan and Korea and Tibet. It's found in Nepal, Bhutan, Vietnam, and also parts of India. Although Buddhism isn't big in India, but there are Buddhists there. And some of the denominations of Mahayana you would have heard of are Zen. I say Zen or Chan. What's Chan? Chan is the Chinese word for Zen. And when Zen comes over to Japan, they try to pronounce Zen, and they try to pronounce Chan, and it comes out Zen. The same thing. There's Pure Land, which is really interesting. And there's Sharon, there's a Shingon, there's several different groups we can't really go into. For all the Mahayana traditions, there's a very influential text called the Lotus Sutra. Now, already there are all these sutras of the Buddha's sermons, and these are all the Buddhist scriptures, and Mahayana and Theravada agree on those. But this is something that Mahayana believes in and Theravada doesn't. It's a final discourse between Buddha and his favorites, they say. And there are many teachings in here, but one is one vehicle. Buddhism is one thing. There are a lot of different ways it can be interpreted, but it's all part of the same movement. And many skillful means that you can achieve salvation or liberation through meditation, through work, through faith. Any Buddhist way can be a way to salvation. So this Lotus Sutra comes up, and so now they feel they've got the authentic Buddhist teaching, because this is something Buddhists have right before the end. Anybody have any thoughts about that, or want to chime in? And it's very beautiful. You ever get a chance to read it. So already there are these Buddhist sermons that have been written down, and the way they wrote them down is it looks like Phoenician blinds. They had these long strips of bamboo, and they would engrave the words on there and then rub a kind of ink wash over it, and that's how the letters would get in there, and then they would tie them up like a Venetian blind. So there are all these what are called sutras. And then this comes up. This is new. Lotus Sutra. And of course, Theravada does not accept this. So Mahayana has things like savior gods, if essentially gods. Salvation by grace is one of the things that are in there. Appeals to the common people. And for some denominations like Zen, there's a lot of work involved with achieving liberation. And for others like Pure Land, you can't do anything. You're a hopeless sinner. Let's hear about Pure Land. The person they're shooting the rays out of his face is the Amida Buddha. Who is the Amida Buddha? The Amida Buddha is a bodhisattva. He is enlightened, so he's a Buddha. He's also, his name is Amitabha, or the Amida Buddha. There's salvation and there's heaven to go to when you die. Not reincarnation immediately. You can go through a lifetime in a paradise. And you get there by trust in your Lord Amida Buddha. And this may start to sound familiar, like something from not from Buddhism. The strength of Amitabha saves us, not our own strength. We have to trust him in faith and then do good works. And it's one of the most popular forms of Buddhism. There's another Amida Buddha. If you wish to come and be born in my realm after this lifetime, you must always call me to mind again and again. You must always keep this thought in mind without letting up, and thus you will succeed in coming to be born in my realm. We could go into detail about what's going on here, but there are a number of bodhisattvas, and they each have what's called a Buddha field, and that's a heaven that they just for their followers. So the idea is, you can't save yourself, you're weak and sinful, but if you put your trust in the Lord Amida Buddha and trust him as your savior, he will save you. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
David, I have a
Pardon?
question. There is a saying in this tradition that I've read about that anyone who declares their belief in the in this bodhisattva, once in their life is saved. That's all that's required.
Yeah, I've heard that, but also there's this idea that you've got to be constantly keeping it in mind. So it's kind of like different varieties of evangelicalism. Can you just go forward and profess your faith once, or do you have to have a faithful life? A little bit like that. But you've got a Lord and Savior, and that person is going to save you. You're not going to save yourself. So it might be according to some tradition, I guess, a momentary confession. You might forget about it, but you're still in the camp. Or as this quote suggests, you've got to stick with it every day.
And there's also a universalist strain in this tradition that says that ultimately everyone will be enlightened. Everyone.
That's
will,
right. That's an important part of Mahayana in general, is what's called bodhisattva, which you don't need to know that term, but it means that we strive for the enlightenment of all people and all sentient beings. So, very different from Theravada. Theravada says, not only will not all people be saved, to use that language, but not all Theravadas will get saved, only the monks, and not all of them, right? So it's a very narrow, it's sometimes called the narrow way, but they don't like it, so don't say that to them.
Do they
Go ahead,
argue?
okay.
Do those schools argue a lot? Like, did they ever like, I guess they can't come to violence because that's part of their code, but did they ever have anything close to wars of religion, like Protestant Roman Catholics.
I'm not
have.
aware of anything like that. I haven't come across it. I think that, I mean, I've talked to one Theravada Buddhist and he was, just kind of dismissive of Mahayana. But it wasn't like he, wanted to fight them or something.
Yeah.
I mean, some Buddhists do fight, by the way, but not over this.
When did Pure Land start?
Boy, let me think if I can remember. Yeah, I think I took some slides out just so it wouldn't be too tedious. And I'm not sure what year it was.
This,
Google.
which, like, was it AD or BC?
It's gonna be BC, I think.
Huh.
Yeah, I don't have my phone with me. I Google it.
That's good.
That's assignments for everybody. Find out when this started. But here's some major teachings of Mahayana, and the first one that we just said is universalism. Everybody will eventually become enlightened. What I call bodhisattva. It's our job to try to help all people and all sentient beings, all monkeys, all dogs, to achieve enlightenment. Otherwise, they'll have to suffer. Compassion. It's a religion of compassion. And the bodhisattvas are compassionate towards us. They're going to help us out. And they've got a lot of merit because they're way up there in enlightenment, but they're going to give us some. Kind of like the saints in some versions of Catholicism, I think. They were here, now they're up there, and they're trying to help us. There's not just liberation, there's also kind of salvation. Salvation is to be reborn in a celestial realm, some wonderful place, like where Amida Buddha is. And then, this is a weird term, you're not going to remember this, but transcendental immanence. There is a Buddha principle present in all beings. What is the Buddha principle? At your very core, you are a Buddha. You don't know it, but you are. A little bit about Zen. There are a couple symbols of Zen. One is a meditating monk seated facing a wall, and the other is the great empty circle. It's a kind of meditation Buddhism. Began in China, spread to Japan and Korea, where it's called Zen Buddhism, and Vietnam. So enlightenment is available. Now, enlightenment is not, we're going to immediately go to heaven or something, but we're going to get insight into the nature of our own mind. You can look and see what your own mind is, and that what you think is a being is really just ultimately empty. Mahayana teaches, all Mahayana teach that at the center of all things is emptiness. This is an interesting principle. And you can see where they got this from Buddha. I mean, because Buddha says that things are not permanent. Pardon me. COVID germs. Did I come through the computer? I hope not. I don't feel like I have COVID, but on the other hand, I don't feel like great right now, so maybe I do. Anyway, so the point is that the great insight is that the center of all beings, their ultimate nature, is empty. There's nothing there. And so in ordinary life, we think that there are chairs and wagons and people and houses, but really there's nothing there. But it's okay to talk about them as though they're there, because that's just how we get by. But ultimately it's empty there, and we're empty too.
It's the theory of the empty cup, right?
Okay.
What is the theory of the empty cup?
I'm not sure I know.
Or to learn and grow, and please help me on this, you have to be empty. in
Oh,
order
yeah.
receive
Right.
enlightenment. You
Yeah.
can't be filled and busy. And
Oh,
when I was in Japan, I was given as a gift an hour of a Zen monk in Kyoto.
Mm.
And I prepared for this in American style. That was the wrong thing to do.
Right.
Oh, okay,
And
okay.
it was the monastery where the famous garden is. And I left that session feeling about, this high. Because everything he said refuted anything that was in my mind. And it was so calm and loving and beautiful. And I wound up
Wow.
feeling I knew nothing and I was very full and I needed to be empty.
Uh-huh.
Great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was quite an experience, actually,
Yeah.
and it stayed with me
Yeah.
for these decades. It
Mhm.
just
Well,
was-
that's a revelation in and of itself.
And I still don't understand what happened, but I'm still
Right.
thinking about it.
It was interesting. She was not enlightened.
No, that was perfectly clear. I was not at that point yet.
Yeah, right. But
So,
is recognizing that you're full and needing to be emptied a part of the enlightenment? though?
yeah, it would be.
Yeah. So you think I had taken a little tiny step, maybe?
You did.
I think maybe some of the fullness splashed out of you.
It spilled out. of it.
Yeah.
We have a lot of books, Zen and the art of archery, Zen and the
Mhm.
and art, Zen and the art of skiing, and they're
Motorcycle,
all in my
motorcycle,
bookshelf.
Yeah.
Because it really has a lot to do with music and performing.
Yeah, and the idea there is that
That doesn't.
you are trying various ways to get at an insight about yourself, which I think sounds like you had, Tanya. And you can do it through meditation, through a certain kind of breathing discipline, acts of mindfulness, like paying close attention to everything that's happening in the tea ceremony, learning archery and swordsmanship in a way that you're not
Sure do.
exerting effort, you're just letting it
Archery
happen.
and Swordsmanship. Why is that part of enlightenment?
Because this is something that we normally do very consciously and with discipline. And if you can learn to do it going with the force, any of you Star Wars fans will know what that is. This is about going with the force.
But Diane, I think you bring up a good point, because if the Buddhist philosophy is generally non-violent, why train in
Those are
violent?
competitive kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's more like the archery and swordsmanship side of things, especially amongst like the Japanese and Buddhists. Of the time, it was more about emptying yourself, and instead of acting with emotion or rage the way that
Right.
the rabble would, samurai were calm and were able to have precise movements and forms, and they were perfecting the art of killing people, right? And turning it into an art form and an ability.
But
to
how
do
can
things.
swordsmanship be an art form if you're
Killing
setting
someone.
out to injure someone?
Yeah.
Well, the way they do it in the monastery is they don't use swords, they use like long sticks. And they
And
don't actually hit
don't
each
wanna
other.
hurt somebody.
Yeah.
They
But
don't
does-
actually, they don't hit each other.
Does it just come from the culture? I mean, was swordsmanship and archery just something that everybody did then?
Well, they had to
Yeah,
kill,
they
or-
didn't have
kill
guns.
the animals they ate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but
Other-
If you're like a person in today's world, can you substitute archery for, artisanal bread making
Oh, I think so.
or something else, non-violent, or does it need
Yeah,
to
you
be
can
archery?
maintain your motorcycle, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
right,
But they do
Oh, yeah,
mention that,
there's
it is
that in
part
the
of it, so it seems like it's
yeah.
something that is confusing to me.
What time is it, Joyce, you know?
Violent.
Some of it might be, this is part of the world and this is going to happen. So if you're going to do it like this.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? So like, I don't think that they could set up they still needed armies. I don't think that they had any conscientious objector option sort of thing.
Oh,
So if you are going to be in this trade, then act in this particular way. You still use the breathing techniques. You still see yourself as emptiness. So there's another fantasy
Yeah.
series called The Wheel of Time, and the image there. So this kid learned from his dad, completely wiping out his, like, trying to turn everything in his mind to black when he was doing archery, except for one flame, and that flame is whatever your aim was or your target. So that idea of emptying, again, the less emotion, you're trying to be fluid. But it was that discipline that allowed him to kind of take his next metaphysical steps. So these
What, Joyce?
physical activities. Yeah, so that's, and the
Oh.
author deliberately used these Zen concepts with these images in his book.
I feel like while I can understand that on an intellectual level, I feel like I also understand an aversion to anything that would paint a veil over something that causes real suffering or takes
Yeah.
part in real suffering like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can see like dancing around with a sword but not hurting anyone is something beautiful, and taking a lot of focus not to hurt yourself or anyone around you. But in actual combat or war, I feel like anything that paints a veil over the real suffering and bloodshed isn't something to be celebrated. And by the way, it's Gandhi's birthday. All this.
Oh,
just-
yay.
Yeah, okay.
Happy birthday. Well, I think you need to understand Buddhism, there is a strong connection between Buddhism and martial arts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much.
Not just Zen, but also in Tibetan Buddhism. And so there is a connection with violence. Also, if we get to this, the monasteries in Tibet had warrior monks that would fight other warrior monks from other monasteries. It's not, if you think this is some wonderful nonviolent thing, it's a wonderful contrast to our Western religion. It's not really. I mean, it's a religion that's prepared to deal with, and to accept violence.
I guess maybe they would say, Lindsay, to your point, that that our preoccupation or our ethics or our morals are actually about what suffering is, or just silliness. That's the wrong way to look at them. Right? That's might be what some people might say. Life is suffering. The only reason you're suffering is because you're desiring your expectations. Right? I guess, which is
It's a whole different
complete,
perspective.
yep. And I also say, nope.
Yeah,
It's
worth understanding, but not necessarily agreeing to in
Yeah.
all of its.
I would like to recommend, if you're interested in exploring the mind, the classic Zen and the Art of Archery by Harregel. It's a tiny book, maybe 100 pages. And he was a German professor of Asian studies in Japan, in Germany. When Japan opened its doors, he was like the first one, he and his wife on the boat to go and actually see Japanese culture, which he was teaching that he had never experienced before. And he decided that he needed to involve himself in a discipline that would allow him to learn. So he decided to study the art of archery, and his wife did flower arranging. And the book shows his changing mind as he came to the teachings of his teacher, and to the Zen and like becoming one with things and not being busy. And
Yeah.
it's quite a description of the journey. I used to recommend this for all my
Yeah,
freshman
right.
students until I found out when he went back to Germany, he supported the Nazi movement.
Wow.
And I thought it wasn't appropriate any longer, but I, in myself, I think, well, this was before he had those tendencies.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
Thank you for
Maybe
sharing
one-
that.
one small correction to this. When he decided to study the Zen, he looked for a teacher. He looked for someone to teach him, and no one would take him on.
that's right.
And so the only one that actually accepted him was the archer. So that's how he got it.
Oh.
That's how it became the art. He became.
So it could have been a bread maker, who knows, but it was an art.
Oh, that's right. It could have been, he was just looking for somebody who would be willing because he was a doer and you can't be.
Right.
You know. you-
And along with the doing is rational thought.
Yeah.
We tend to think that we're going to get to the truth through reason.
Yeah, we're gonna make
That's
it happen.
that's basic to Western philosophy, of course, and to most people's life, actually.
Yep.
And one of the things that Zen tries to do is to shake you out of your dependence on rationality, to just directly experience and not to think about it too much. So here's some koans that a Zen master might pose to his or her pupils. A student asked Master Yongmen, "Not even a thought has arisen. Is there still a sin or not?" Master replied, "Mount Sumeru." Well, it's not an answer to anything, right? But what it does, it jolts the mind. If you're looking for an answer to that question, which is a pretty hard question, by the way. If you're looking for an answer to that, what he's saying is there isn't an answer to it. So we're jostling the mind. A monk asked Xiaozhou, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" That's this ultimate Buddha inside of them. Or not? Yes, by the way, they do. I think. Xiaozhou says, "Woo." What?
Yeah.
Hui Ying asked Hui Ming, "Without thinking of good or evil, show me your original face before your mother and father were born." Ooh, that's weird. A monk asked Dongshan Shoshu, "What is Buddha?" Dongshan said, 3 pounds of flax.
All right.
Mhm.
And then the famous one, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Which, by the way, is this. So the idea is that through a variety of meditative techniques and things like making tea and just other things like that, we're trying to be in the moment, be present, and not have our mind always racing, trying to figure things out. And so that's what the koans are supposed to do. Now, Tibet is wacky. And well, it's really different. Because when Buddhism came to Tibet, there was already a religion there called Bon, B-O-N. And Bon was shamanism.
Mhm.
It was like supernatural stuff, and these shaman priests would wear black robes and pointed hats, and you would go to them to work magic for you. And Buddhism came into Tibet and said, "Well, we can work with that. Come on in. You can be part of us." Buddhism is now called a separate vehicle from Mahayana by many people. It's called the Diamond Vehicle. So the thing about the Diamond Vehicle is that it's what's called a Lamaism. What's a Lama? The Dalai Lama, right? A Lama is a monk, and the monks rule the country. They are the economic, educational, defense. It's all in the monastery. Now, there are two kinds of monks. There are two schools, red hat and yellow hat. Dalai Lama is a yellow hat. And they call him red hat and yellow hat because of the color hats they wear. Yeah, they're somewhat different too. They use sacred formulas like Om Mani Padme Hum. They use mandalas, wheels, prayer wheels, lots of interesting magical kind of stuff. And the most famous thing that comes out of Tibetan Buddhism, perhaps, is the Bardo Thotral, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which tells you exactly what happens to you when you die, according to them. So again, the Red Hats engage in some magic. They practice something called the Chad ritual, which you don't want me to tell you about. It's kind of horrible. And they use the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Yellow Hats, are also called Gelugpa, is a reformed tantrism. They kind of chilled out a little bit on some of the craziness, and their leader is the Dalai Lama, and he's one of the most respected religious leaders in the world, I think. I like everything he says. He's a good guy. So there's a yellow hat monk, and there's some red hat monks, and the whole robe is yellow, not just the. So the monastery was a very important phenomenon. 1/4 of all men were in the monastery, and they were celibate, supposedly. And there were great monastery fortresses that were centers of trade and government. And warrior monks fought against other monks. And they ruled and exploited the common people. Now you might think, oh, it's unfortunate that a monastery does this. Monasteries in the West were very similar. You think of Christian monasteries, they were the major thing in the area. They were where all the education was. So there's some similarities, but I think the monasteries here are a bit more. I mean, well, they have a military presence as well. So there's a warrior monk. You ever heard of the Shaolin monks? You ever heard of those? I don't know much about them, but yeah, it's an awesome outfit. I kind of like to have that.
Seems like it'd
That's
be
actually
hard.
my academic gown, but it's hanging up in the closet. That's pretty cool. They engaged in meditation, they wrote history, they cast spells, and there were also nuns. It wasn't just for men. And also something called yogis. And you find this in Hinduism too. Not everybody fits into the system. Some people just are kind of off on their own trying to find enlightenment. And that's what the yogis are. That's true here, and it's true in India as well.
Isn't it also true in Jellystone Park?
Yeah, Yogi Bear, that's right. Boo-boo. And the yogis were not celibate. They weren't really subject to any rules. They could do what they wanted. We're good at time here. We're almost out of time. A little bit about the Bardo Thodol. It's the official title is the liberation through hearing during the intermediate state. What's the intermediate state? The time, there's a time between your death and your rebirth in another realm. And during that time, we are going to talk to you, your body. We're going to talk to you as you're dying, and we'll talk to you when you're dead to get through to your soul, or whatever you want to call it. Not really a soul, but it was probably around for longer than this, but sometime in the 8th century, it was written down. We call it the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it tells you what to expect when you die. So it's read to the dying person to guide them, because as you're dying, and even as you're dead, you have choices to make that will affect the kind of rebirth you get. So you have experiences between death and the next rebirth, and this tells you what happens. And this whole interview is called, interlude rather, is called the Bardo. There was a book a couple years ago, Lincoln and the Bardo, which I kind of would like to read, actually.
Strange.
So what happens if you don't have the text read to you when you die. You've always anticipated that you're going
Then
to
you
have
you will
it.
have a bad your rebirth you might come back as an animal. You're not gonna have as good a rebirth. But hopefully you'd like to come back as a human because then you have the best chance of achieving enlightenment in your next life. And so as you're wandering through the bardo, we're trying to guide you not to fall into temptations that are offered to you, but just keep holding on to achieve enlightenment. So the bardo of the moment of death is where you experience the clear light of reality. And everybody talks about that light you're supposed to see when you die. That's called the Chinkai bardo. Then the Chunyad bardo is the bardo of the experience of reality, where you experience a variety of visions. And it takes about 45 days. One of the reasons we cremate you is to help you it's hard to leave your body. I mean, you love it. You want to be with it, right? And you've got to learn to just say goodbye to your body. So in this 45-day period, you're kind of wandering around, you're encountering various visions, all of which are projections of your own mind, but they're still scary. And then the bardo of rebirth is where you will have a lot of hallucinations, which karma powers. Pardon me. And you will eventually be reborn. It could be an animal, could be a human, could be a god. Now, by the time you get to Tibetan Buddhism, they have no trouble talking about gods. They're happy with God. We'll talk about gods all day long. Okay, so that's really all I want to say about that. Any thoughts before we wrap up? We're got like a minute.
Well, one problem I always have with this this system of thought is that I keep wondering who the person is that goes through these processes, since there is no self, and
Yeah.
no subject of experience. It's ultimately emptiness.
Yeah, it's a little hard to grasp. I mean, when you actually try to nail it down, there isn't any self there. At the core of your being is emptiness. The core of all things in the world is emptiness, but you still go through stuff. And it's hard to understand why that is.
So maybe it's flipped. Maybe the ethics or you're not trying to think of the self, yourself as a self. Like I should think of me as a vehicle, and everything that I do is trying to be right actions of my vehicle in the world, so it can release into the nothingness. Right?
Yeah, that sounds about right, I think.
Maybe it's more the vehicle is the emphasis.
It seems very useful as a psychological concept.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like a religion.
Yeah.
It
I'm
just
so glad
doesn't.
you're a Christian. I'm telling you, it makes sense and it's easy to understand. This is too much for me.
But they're contradictions.
Yeah. That's a lot.
Yeah, if we believe in an all-knowing God, then I don't worry about all these nuances that are created in these other religions.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of insight and beauty here. It's not something I want to necessarily follow. And of course, the question for Buddhism is always, is it really even a religion, or is it just a philosophy of life? I would say by the time you get to Mahayana, you're definitely in a religion.
Yeah.
Theravada is kind of more of a philosophy, I think. But yeah, it's it's a lot.
Also, the core aspect of studying other religions is to better understand, embrace the diversity of human experience,
Yes.
or to better understand your own. So yeah, God's got us. We're fine, right?
Right.
But there's so much about him and about ourselves that we don't understand fully, that looking at other people and seeing what the baseline continual thing is, there is a desire for something better after this world.
Yeah.
So,
Well-
and there's a desire for, removing that which is an impediment. So like with the Zen archery, you're removing all the distractions, you're removing all the emotion. You're focusing on the task itself. And there's a lot of that desire and the hecticness of this world too.
I always wonder what, because the timing, please correct me if I'm wrong, David, but the timing of the spread of Buddhism, this is happening in Central Asia, Western Asia. This is around the time of Jesus, and it's very different than Judaism, which is what they were kind of
Right.
dealing with there. So I always wonder, did this have an influence on Jesus when he was preaching? So I don't know. If
Yeah, I
there's-
don't know if anybody's if it looked into that or not. Yeah, so Jesus would be actually later than Buddhism. But I mean, Buddha is like 500 BC. Buddha is 0 BC, right? Or 0 AD. So would would there have been any influence in Judaism from Buddhism or Hinduism? It's hard to know. I mean, Judaism didn't seem particularly open to what other religions had to say. I mean, they definitely felt like they had the answer, but who knows? That's a good question.
I mean, the incarnation and the resurrection of the body suggests a holistic, not a mind body or mind soul separation, but seems to be a part of this, that you leave the vessel of your earthly experience behind, and even whatever you call a self behind, eventually. So
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think we need to officially shut this little party down. Next week, 2 religions you don't know anything about: Jainism and Sikhism, even though there are Jain and Sikh temples really close to here. But nobody knows. I mean, who knows about Jainism and Sikhism? And they're not together for any reason other than that it just worked out nicely that way. They don't really influence each other. They're very different. But somebody had something to say. I'm sorry.
is that the Sikh temple? Is that up on Bloomingdale Road or Gary Road? Where is the
Sikh
temple?
temple is actually in a neighborhood in Wheaton, just north of Wheaton Warrenville South High School.
Former clubhouse for our community.
Yeah, former community clubhouse. But the Jain temple is up there, and it's pretty fancy.
Jane's on 59.
Jains seem to have a lot of money for various reasons. So they can really spend a lot of money on a temple. So I hope you will enjoy learning about that next week and seeing what you think about it. So everybody have a great service. I'm going to be here sick
Yep.
with the COVID.
Feel better. Feel better.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I hope I'll be back next week.
We're on
Patty,
59.
your question, I took.
Yeah, did
looked
you
it
get
up